for what he does within the transportation community, but what he's doing for the entire nation. So with that, let me bring the Congressman to the stage.
Thank you very much. Brother Mims, I am indeed honored to do this one more time. A lot of people don't know it, but Comco really had to work overtime for this session because I spent almost my entire summer in the hospital. Had heart surgery that took me for a loop. You know how the doctor tell you you're gonna be out in 3 days? Hello. I was back in 110 days. But I want to thank you, Brother Mims, and I want to thank my staff and the board and the staff from Comco for all that you have done to bring us together. As I was listening to Brother Mims talk, something hit me. It's not even in my notes. And my mother, who is a 91-year-old Pentecostal minister, used to always say those things that happen during the service that are unplanned are the most meaningful. I want you to, he talked about basically not taking our eyes off the prize. We are now dealing with a president that I have described as abracadabra, hocus pocus. Come on now. And I think that we have to be very vigilant wherever we are. Because during the moments of hocus pocus, during the moments of abracadabra, during the moments of distraction, we can lose sight of the things we are fighting for. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not about who we're fighting against. It's what we're fighting for. It's what we're fighting for. Some of us become glued to the television. Never did look at MSNBC except to see President Obama. And now we can hardly wait to find out the next bad news coming out of the White House. But do not be distracted. We are in a place right now that is not normal. And we must never, ever let it become normal. We must never let it become normal to be dealing with alternative facts. Come on now. What's up with that? We do not teach our children to lie. Alternative facts. My point is that our president has moved us to this new sense of normal. And it must be unacceptable to every single one of us. And so I thank Comco for including all of its board members, officers, members, and everybody and I want to thank again all of you for what you do. So much has happened since the last Braintrust. Frankly, I'm still not used to saying the words President and Trump together. However, I've made it clear that if the president is willing to work for policies and programs that will truly benefit all of the American people, I will work with him. One area in which I was hopeful that we might be able to work together on is infrastructure. Infrastructure is so very, very important. President Trump said in his victory speech on election night, and I quote, "We're going to fix our inner cities and rebuild our highways, bridges, tunnels, airports, schools, and hospitals. We're going to rebuild our infrastructure, which will become, by the way, second to none. And we will put millions of our people to work as we rebuild. End of quote. I was hopeful that President Trump would be willing to work on measures that would make the investments in transportation and other infrastructure that we so sorely need. Sadly, in infrastructure, as in so many policy areas, President Trump's first budget proposal not only failed to fulfill his promises, Stephanie, it would actually have destroyed existing programs. In his first budget proposal, President Trump proposed cutting the Department of Transportation's budget by 13%. Hello? 13%. Hello? He proposed ending all federal support for Amtrak's long-distance trains. He would also have ended federal investments in new transit projects, eliminating essential air service, and ending the Tiger Grant program. Fortunately, the omnibus appropriations measure, ultimately adopted by the Congress, did not make any of these cuts. However, President Trump's first budget is a warning that before we do anything else, we must stay vigilant to defend our priorities and our existing programs. While I am willing to work with the President when he wants to build our nation up, I will oppose every effort, every single effort, to tear down what we have already built. My mother used to say to her children, she said, I want you to go up the ladder, but I don't want you to fall down. While you're climbing, don't you fall down. And so today's Braintrust will discuss how we can ensure that transportation projects funded through any of the many so-called innovative or alternative funding mechanisms are inclusive. In considering any funding option, we must keep two basic principles in mind. The first principle is this: every discussion about our investments in transportation must reflect our need to ensure that every single dollar we spend helps to build bridges over our deep divides and move every American forward. When I met with President Trump, he got all confused. I said, Mr. President, you can be one of the greatest presidents in the world that the world ever saw, if you did things that would benefit all the people and make all the people's lives better, like prescription drugs and things of that nature. And then he went out and said, he left out the if, and said, said he's the greatest president that ever lived. You know, I live in the inner city, and when I got home that night, the brothers on the street said, what's up to that? What's up to that, Mr. Cummings? What's up with that? Then I had to explain. And the second principle is this: any funds we spend from any source for any type of infrastructure project must be spent in a process that will ensure minority businesses are able to compete for the work. Come on, y'all need to give a hand on that one. That's yours. We got to work at that. Don't forget what I told you. You can be distracted. You can be so distracted that we forget what we're fighting for. And after the Trump storm is over, the expectations of people, businesses, and others will be so ratcheted down that we will be in deep trouble. And so if any innovative or alternative funding mechanism meets these principles, then we can be sure that the projects they fund will be inclusive and will create opportunities for all Americans. Let me briefly explore these principles and then I'm finished. Too many times in the past, we failed to make investments in a way that will ensure that the infrastructure we build creates connections rather than barriers. Anybody familiar? The bus system that don't go to certain shopping centers. Hello. Right here in D.C., certain things happening. Certain folks don't want you in Georgetown. Amen? Come on, don't act like y'all don't know what I'm talking about. We simply cannot repeat those mistakes again. As the Department of Transportation wrote under President Obama, and I quote, and I do say President Obama, and this is the quote from President Obama, so I don't want y'all to get confused. There's a regrettable legacy of aligning and designing transportation projects that separated Americans along economic and even racial lines, end of quote. The evidence of this legacy and its impact on creating the spaces apart within which low and moderate income communities and communities of color live is everywhere around us. Too often, however, we don't stop to think how the physical connections or barriers that exist in our world are the manifestations of intentional decisions. Hello. And some of you are in positions to help make certain decisions. Let me give you a footnote on that, and then Brother Menz, I'm going to close up, I promise. If you've been blessed enough to sit in a position where you help make decisions about transit and roads, and don't forget about the bridge that brought you where you are. Don't forget about the grandmother who prayed for you. Don't forget about Boo J and Lil Bubba, who don't have a car. Don't forget about them. Don't sit there like you just some kind of stranger and ain't got nothing to say. Sometimes you have been placed there because you've been through it. You've been a witness. And so you must use your pain that you went through, turn it into a passion to do your purpose. You're there for a reason. You went through what you went through for a reason. The pain that you suffered is so that you can come back and have passion for others who may be in those positions. And so we cannot ensure the future we will build with the investments we make today, and it doesn't perpetuate this legacy unless we clearly trace the lines through our lives and community by past decisions. And we cannot ensure that the infrastructure we build today meets all of a community's residents unless we ensure that the processes we use to guide new investments engage every community member in an effort that prioritizes creating opportunity and expanding mobility. Somebody once said that you can tell the depth of poverty in any community, panelists, if you look at whether they're able to move around. Come on now. If you can't move, you can't get to a job, can't get to church, can't move, your kids can't get to school. If you cannot move. So you all are some very, very important people. Therefore, the first standard that any new or alternative financing methods must meet is this. It must ensure that every dollar we spend helps to build bridges, not walls, and moves every American forward. Now, as I'm sure you know, we're discussing alternative financing mechanisms primarily because the Fixing America's Surface Transportation, or FAST Act, which will guide the federal investments in surface programs through fiscal year 2020, fails to meet our nation's need for expanded investments. The FAST Act The FAST Act authorizes $305 billion for surface transportation infrastructure from fiscal year 2016 through fiscal year 2020. And so while that sounds like a lot of money, it's really just slightly above the existing funding levels and programs that were in place before the FAST Act was enacted, and is barely enough to enable states to maintain existing infrastructure. I see you, Brother Mims. I see you. I got you. I got you. You got to remember, I've been in the hospital bed all summer, so I'm just getting out. I got to say what I got to say. Amen. In addition, nearly a quarter of the bill is paid for by sources other than the gas tax, which has not been raised since 1993. Thus far, despite his stated desire to build new infrastructure, President Trump has not provided many specifics on his plan to do so. That's why you all have got to be the strongest advocates you've ever been. He did hold a press conference in which he vowed to reform what he called the nation's badly broken infrastructure permitting process, end of quote. Among the regulations he said he would roll back were new standards introduced by President Obama to reduce the risk that flooding could inundate infrastructure paid for with federal funds. Of course, shortly after Trump's press conference, Hurricanes Harvey and Irma hit. I hope that the President will rethink whether all current regulations are as awful as his rhetoric claimed them to be. And last year, Trump's advisors issued a white paper that seemed to suggest that his strategy for expanding investments is to offer a tax credit, and I hope the panelists will talk about this, for equity investments in infrastructure. While tax credits can be important tools, the reality is that in the infrastructure arena, they would spur investments only in those projects that can generate revenues like toll highways. Tax cuts would not meet our need to make investments to address deferred maintenance on transit systems, or to build rural roads or rehabilitate bridges and roads that are not tolled. And if such funds are not channeled through existing federal programs or through procurement processes that include strong and specific disadvantaged business enterprise requirements, we cannot ensure that any expanded investments we make will create opportunities for all Americans to compete on these projects. DBE participation requirements cannot be an afterthought. By the way, as I've said to my governor many times, we pay taxes too. And this brings me to my final point. The second key principle that we must guide us in any method proposed for funding infrastructure: any funds we spend from any source for any type of infrastructure project must be spent in a process that will ensure minority businesses are able to compete for the work. And so as I close, I say this. Let me be clear that I believe that we need to make investments such as those proposed by the Democratic members of the United States Senate, who have released what they call, quote, blueprint to rebuild America's infrastructure. I would recommend it to all of you. The blueprint would guide the investment of more than $1 trillion over 10 years in federal funds to modernize all modes of infrastructure while creating an estimated 15 million jobs. But again, ladies and gentlemen, we've got to be vigilant. We've got to use organizations like COMTO to make the loudest cry out that we can. And you gotta understand that I don't know what's going to happen after Trump. You ever thought about that? I mean, think about it. I mean, y'all so worried about Trump. What's going to happen after Trump? You know, I used to tell people you have to respect the storm and go through that storm with respect. and always have an eye of coming out of the storm and asking the question, where will I be? Where will our organizations be? Where will our minority contractors be? Where will they be? And so, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored. I am truly honored. I didn't know that I'd be able to be here today, but I am honored to be here and to host you one more time. And I thank you for what you do, because you're the ones who are making a difference. You're the ones who are not only trying to make a difference for you, but making a difference for people that you don't even know, but also making a difference for generations yet unborn. May God bless.
Let's thank the Congressman again for his awesome remarks as usual. Thank you. Congressman, one thing I want to do is remind you, Compto National Conference, annual conference is in Baltimore next year, and we're going to be there, and we're going to welcome your involvement, significant involvement in our conference and our conference planning as we're going forward. So thank you. Thank you. So we all look forward to our participation. Michelle, where's Michelle? Michelle is the queen of our conference, the chair of our conference as we're going forward. So look for us. We all hope to see you in Baltimore. And so as we're going forward, let's bring Renee to the stage to introduce our mistress of ceremony today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. Really appreciate it. And I wanted to get ready to introduce our moderator for this important panel with the very important topics. I wanted to thank my legislative counsel for everything that they did for this event and also for A View from the Hill, which I think was also very successful this morning. So thank you to my committee. Our moderator today is Stephanie Beasley, and I'm really pleased. I was really pleased to meet you, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Stephanie Beasley is transportation security reporter for Politico. Stephanie is a transportation expert, and prior to joining Politico, she covered transportation for Bloomberg BNA. She started her policy career reporting on the FDA for Inside Washington Publishers. Stephanie is an alumna of Oberlin College and UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. She's also a native of Dayton, Ohio, and like her fellow Daytonians, Wilbur and Orville Wright, you could say she was destined for a career in transportation. I'd like to welcome to the podium Ms. Stephanie Beasley.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here to introduce our distinguished panel and to continue the conversation about U.S. infrastructure and how to get to innovative discussions about funding and other issues. And so I'm just going to go down the line here and make sure I have everybody's correct order. First, we have Dr. Beverly Scott, who is the founder and principal of Beverly Scott Associates, LLC, an infrastructure-focused executive management consultant practice which specializes in workforce development at all levels. She has over 30 years in the industry and is recognized throughout the U.S. and North American transportation industry for her visionary leadership, results-driven management style, focus on people and communities, and progressive approach to labor management relations. Please welcome her. Next, we have Michael J. Garner, who is Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for the New York Metropolitan Transit Authority. He has a long history in the minority business community. He's a passionate advocate for long-range minority small business development and has been the recipient of numerous awards for his work in creating opportunities for minority, women-owned, and disadvantaged business enterprises. Welcome. And next, we have Regine Bogouf. Yes. Got it. Who is a civil engineer with 33 years of large transportation project experience in the U.S. and Canada. She currently serves as Director of Client Services at Fishbeck, Thompson, Carr, and Huber. She was previously a Vice President at Parsons Corporation and board member of Parsons Transportation Group, Inc. of Michigan. I think it was all set. And next, we have Emeka Moname, close, who is Deputy Executive Director of the Federal City Council, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to the improvement of the District of Columbia. He has many years of experience working on the DC region's transportation and economic development issues, having served as Chief Administrative Officer for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, Director of the DC Department of Transportation, as well as serving on the boards of the Regional Transportation Planning Board and WMATA. And then finally, we have Melvin E. Clark Jr., who is currently owner, chairman, and chief executive officer of GW Peoples Contracting Company, Inc., and has built an impressive 3-decade career building and managing 2 national rail construction companies. GWP is the only national Black-owned railroad construction contractor in the U.S. An aggressive advocate for small and disadvantaged business concerns, Mr. Clark serves on the executive committee of the Congressional Black Caucus Institute's 21st Century Council. In the mid-1990s, Mr. Clark helped establish a mentor-protege program for the Small Business Administration designed to pair minority-owned businesses with large firms with the goals of providing assistance in facilitating procurement of federal contracts. He continued to work with the SBA during both the Clinton and Obama administrations. Welcome. And so now that we have introduced everyone, if each of you can, spend a couple of minutes, let's say about 5 minutes, just talking about your areas of expertise, any particular issues that you are advocating or promoting this year, and if you have any remarks sort of following up on what the congressman said regarding concerns about this administration and transportation focus.
Well, I
Start with
suppose
you, Dr. Scott.
I've never been shy. Okay. Yes, I have. Yes, I have. No, I just want to say really an amen for everything that the congressman said, and I can't say enough in terms of Compto actually having this as the area of focus. I laugh, I say I'm a retired public servant, and had the opportunity to not only be a Compto member for over 30 years, but to have worked in transportation for close to 40 at 9 transit systems and been a GM at 4 of them. So and for me, at the end of the day, as we focus in this area of infrastructure, it has always been about people and communities. And so I say we should not at all be confused about that, because the purpose of the investments is about the outcomes that they produce for people and communities, okay? And I say that and I punctuate it because we will, and I'm putting myself in it too, so and tell me when you want me to shut up, we'll go running around all on a let's get increased investment. We have to have increased investment. And that is absolutely true in every single aspect of American infrastructure, which is abysmal. But at the same time, we cannot be out there advocating for increased public investment in infrastructure if we are not prepared at the same time, not afterwards, to advocate for the outcomes that have to come as a function of that increased investment. And let me simply say, I'm preaching to the choir, but we keep repeating it, is that just because we have increased public investment does not equate into equitable outcomes. And so what the missing ingredient is that we must bring the same intentionality and focus to the equity side of the equation as we do to running out to get the ballot measures and the additional laws and all of that passed, okay? And so in order to do that, it can't be episodic. It can't be just about, it really has to be with real granularity, real laser focus, and really being quite clear about what's happening in terms of this whole, and not just for the ballot measure. There is a whole world in infrastructure of public investment. And I'm going to, for those of you who are aware of it, just let me, I'm going to submit to you, look at the Volcker Alliance report that came out in 2016. I think Secretary Fox has just joined their board of directors. In the world of public procurement today in the US, if we added not one more dime, we are spending, hear me, $2 trillion. 70% of that $2 trillion that is going into infrastructure spending at a public level is being spent at the state and local level, not the federal. Now, federal is very important, but it's being spent at the state and local level. So getting clear about what are the rules of engagement, how do we prioritize projects, what is the data behind it, follow the decision-making and the money, who's sitting at the table, who are the people on these boards, who are the ones making the decisions in terms of how we prioritize the projects. Let's just keep it transportation. Who sits with the MPOs? What are the criteria? What are the performance metrics? How do we report? All of that is what ultimately, I tell people all the time, policy trumps practice. You can have the best person in the world, but if it's not codified, if it's not actually put down, what's the numerator? What's the denominator? How are you going to do it? When is it going to happen? What is the result that's supposed to be produced? We will be out there making investments. What's going to happen in terms of small disadvantaged business enterprise? What's going to happen in terms of jobs creation? What's going to happen in terms of historically underutilized businesses? What's going to happen in terms of healthy communities and healthy lifestyles? And I will submit this, I'm doing some work with CERTA now. It's not a criticism. But let me say this and I'll shut my mouth for a minute. We've played this rumba time and time again. Look at the whole area. Just left Revolution on smart growth and transit-oriented development. Beautiful. Beautiful. And we've been working on it for the last 20-some years, and it has in many respects been hugely successful. But guess one of the things that happened? And we're facing it in community after community. Was it really transit-oriented development, or was it transit-oriented displacement? With gentrification and lack of concern in terms of housing affordability and these kinds of issues. So that now, where we should not be anti these things, communities and people that are in our communities and been there for years are struggling. And so, what was missing? Bringing the same intentionality and focus to the equity side of the picture as we were bringing to the other. So I'm going to I got plenty so in this whole administration that we're in right now, it doesn't, to me, it's almost, this is it. We have to, in fact, put our nose to the grindstone and really, really focus on not just the rhetoric portion of, we all know triple bottom line, but how do you actually operationalize that? I'm not a person, I want to say I'm not personally agnostic to public-private partnerships, but I put myself in the business of going to P3 school because the part that I think we must sharpen is the part about in the public interest. And what does in the public interest really look like, mean, and feel like? And quite candidly, these are extremely complex transactions. And what winds up happening before you know it, your poor community sitting up there hollering with you and your board members, and they're having no idea that there was a 500-some page, 4-volume document that was underpinning a 20-year O&M transaction where they fussing with you about what's the fares gonna be and all that. And quite candidly, for all practical purposes of the tolls, all that went to the pot in the contract that was the deal, okay? And so these are, and not to overdo it once again, I'm saying there's a place, but we have to get very, very sharp about the part about what does in the public interest really mean.
And I would add to that I'm in total agreement with Dr. Scott and the congressman. We advocate for billions of dollars in funding, and then we get it, and then we don't include the emerging MWDBEs in that equation. Let me tell you that I live in a small city called Manhattan, where there's $100 billion on the street right now. The governor has stated that not less than 30% of contract awards out of 96 state agencies and authorities in the state of New York will be awarded to certified firms. 30%, the highest in the country. This governor, I always thought that Nelson Rockefeller was the greatest governor in the history of New York. World Trade Center, Battery Park City, SUNY, the rebuilding of Albany. But this governor is going to go down as the greatest governor in the history of the state of New York because of infrastructure. We are witnessing the remaking of New York as we currently speak, $100 billion in the street. The mayor of the city of New York has matched that. He said that for every city agency that they're going to award 30%. So what's happening in the city of New York now is that we are starting to experience a shortage of MWDB firms. And let me say this, I started out by saying that we advocate for all this funding, but if you live in a city where the unions are not inclusive, I don't care if you get $1 trillion. It's not going to come down, it's not going to trickle down. So what is the answer? The answer is this, right? And we first started at the MTA about 9 years ago. We were averaging about 7% of our contracts being awarded to certified firms. We're now up to 25%. And we're ranked #1 in the state of New York with dollars paid to certified firms. And what does that mean? That means that access to government contracts equals job creation in the black community. It equals home ownership. It equals better educational opportunities and better healthcare options. That's the reason why taxpayers' money should not only be spent in a cost-effective manner, but they should be spent in an inclusive manner, because everybody should benefit from that. So if I got in my car and drove north on Madison Avenue in Manhattan, and I drive by all the ritzy upscale stores like Gucci and the rest, and I pass through Harlem, and I drive over the 138th Street Bridge, I'm in the South Bronx. So the Fortune 500 capital of the world, where billions of dollars of transactions are taking place every single day, the South Bronx, the Bronx as a county, is the third poorest county in the country. Not the state of New York, the third poorest county in the country. How is that possible, being aligned to the Fortune 500 capital of the world? And so we're now making sure that all those companies in the Bronx and Manhattan, everybody is getting a fair share of our taxpayers' dollars. And let me also say that it is extremely important for ComTel, under the leadership of President Mims and Chairman Montague, and my president, Frank Messer of ComTel New York, to ensure that these panels do not come into a moan session, but is filled with information as to how you can go back and get involved in your ComTel chapters and force change. In my second job after my 9 to 5, I'm president of the founding chapter of the 100 Black Men. My first vice president, Aldrin Ennis, is sitting in the back. But my first meeting with the mayor of the city of New York, we didn't ask him. We said that we're going to support you in the creation of a strong MWBE program in the city of New York. And we're going to not only work with you, but we're going to force you to create programs that's going to allow you to once again award your contracts in a cost-effective manner, but in an inclusive manner as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I heard my two colleagues here at the table, and I agree with them about the policy discussion and the practice. I've had the privilege of working on a few P3 projects and in Canada and in the US. And one of them in the US is the Gordie Howe Bridge, the new bridge, the new crossing being proposed between Detroit in Michigan, the USA, and Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And that project, I've been involved with it since 2000, and we are now 2017, and they are in the procurement phase for a P3 to select a concessionaire to design, build, operate, and maintain that facility. So what I'd like to say also is that P3 is here. P3 is here to stay. So what do we do? How do we make sure that the policies that can guarantee equitable outcomes are left in place? I'm listening earlier to the discussion that Congressman Cummings had earlier, and I already can pinpoint to 3 policy areas that can actually endanger those outcomes. One of them is the permitting, the environmental process. Because by the time it comes to procurement, it's already too late to actually influence what the equitable outcome will be. And I say that using the border crossing as an example. When we were going to the environmental phase of that project, we had a community advisory, an advisory committee from the community sitting at the table with us when we were doing this project. At first, I can tell you, we were not welcome. We had very very heated discussion. That's a very nice way of saying that, understatement. When we went into those communities and we were going to build and actually drop this humongous bridge in the community, but in working with people, having the right people there to make decisions, to say that, yes, indeed, we're going to impact this community in a very negative way. What do we do? And how does that community benefit from a project such as this? And so in working with the environmental process, what happened is at the end of it, we have what we call a record of decision. And the record of decision is actually a binding document. It's almost like a contract between the state or the agency that owns the facility and the people, and to make sure that those are the conditions under which this project can proceed. And by doing that, you have no choice. It's illegal. You have to abide by it. And so what happened at the end of the environmental phase of the Detroit River crossing, now called Gordie Howe Bridge, there was this part about workforce development and community benefits. And that was put black on white on paper, and that was signed. So therefore, they had no choice. So now you'll be happy to hear that actually not long ago, about a month ago, or maybe a couple of months ago, the city of Detroit signed an agreement with the board authority in charge of delivering that project for a $48 million settlement that will make sure that the community that received, the host community of the bridge, is improved, community funding. The second thing also, there is another $10 million just for workforce development, and that is to prepare future workers to take advantage, to be able to work on the project. And the third thing also, because we know about economic, environmental justice, and also the fact that Southwest Detroit have the highest the highest level of asthma incidents. And therefore, there is money also put in a fund to monitor the air quality in the area and make sure that appropriate response is taken. So those are all the things that are in there. There may be a couple more that I'm not for remembering exactly. But those things, if the administration really has its way in terms of changing the rules or make it easier or making it, so that it can go quicker into resolution, that's something that we need to watch for, because really that's the basis. That's really where we take a commitment, that P3 or whoever organization makes the commitment. Of course, the state and the city and the federal, at once decided to take that over and give it to the city, as opposed to having the private concessionaire be in charge of that, because those are things that are hard to quantify. But that community advisory group is still in existence and is still guiding the mayor of Detroit and other people still working on this project. So that is one thing. The second thing that I think also that we need to be watchful for is the fact that during the Obama years, there was a regulation in the industry that when federal money was tied to a project, you couldn't restrict or you couldn't really decide that only the local workforce, or you have to have 50% of the workforce be local, because of federal money that comes from the whole nation, anybody could come. And during the Obama years, the President Obama actually reversed that. And so you can have programs such as local workforce development. So that what it does, it opens the door for you to say, okay, I want to set aside at least 50, 51%, and I want to train people and make sure that the local force. So if that's if this is also, that regulation is, goes back to the original regulation, because everything that, of course, President Obama had put forward is being, rescinded now, that's something to look for and to be careful, because what happened before that, all these major projects, because most of the dollars in Michigan, where I'm from, the majority of the funding and in construction in projects occurs in the Detroit area, but who benefits from it? So now there is a real effort at making sure that the people in the city of Detroit benefit from it. So if that changes, we revert. So equitable outcome goes out the window. So those are the things we need to be very mindful of. And I think the third thing that we should, and even though we take it for granted that the federal government allocates so much, or has, the law is that so much of the federal funding must go to DBs and WBs and small business, this is not a given. It is a given today, but it can change at any time. So those are the things that I wanted to bring up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just in the interest of time, I'll be fairly brief. Can you hear me okay? Great. I want to talk about intentionality, because I've heard that a couple times, both from the congressman and from Dr. Scott. I think infrastructure in and of itself is intentional, even the way that it's built, the way that it shapes communities. I think in the previous generations, there was intentionality about where roads went and who was impacted by those roads. As we think about infrastructure for our future, I hear this word of intentionality being repeated in my mind. Intentionality about who is making decisions about how we build infrastructure, where we build it. I think there is a really strong need as we look to the future to make sure that our public servants, our public employees, are as educated as they can be about the process of public-private partnerships, about how projects are decided, how they're funded and financed. I think there needs to be intentionality to ensure that we call on our financiers, builders, and designers and engineers to hold them on account for what we expect for them to deliver for our communities. And I also think there needs to be intentionality about how we think about how we deliver them differently. One of the things we've been doing here locally, here in the District of Columbia, is exploring different ways to structure these innovative project delivery models that start to call upon the community and bring them closer into the project. The idea of a community benefits package, but you have a neighborhood organization that's tied in at the very beginning as you frame and develop and plan that project, so that when you get to the end of the rod or you get to the end of the permitting, you have buy-in and you make sure that that equity piece of it, you make sure that the participation component, even the physical design of the project speaks to the expectations of the community. And I really think that the work that Secretary Fox did in the last administration really was seminal in terms of driving that point at the highest levels in transportation investment in this country, that has to be a part of the way we do business. The last thing I want to say, because I recognize that we need to keep moving on, is that Dr. Scott mentioned that the notion of how we select projects is a mystery to most people. I mean, I know that I've worked in the city, I've worked in the district for about 17 years, and I ran the Department of Transportation under Mayor Fenty here for a couple of years and spent lots of time in the community, and people asked, how did this project become a project? And it was completely opaque to them. And I do think, again, this is where we go back to intentionality. I spent myself probably half of my career in the private sector and half of my career in the public sector. I was able to use that time learning how the private sector looked at business opportunities. And then when I went back into the government side, I understood how the government looked at project opportunities. I'd encourage those of you, either early or the midpoint of your career, to take a chance to kind of go on both sides of the line and understand how both parties do your business so that you can be an informed, both professional and advocate for your community. That's probably one of the most important things, is the capacity of our public sector to be an advocate, a steward for the public interest. And so it served me well, and I think it's a good bit of advice that I received early on that's played out well for me. And the last thing I'll just talk about public-private partnerships. I do think that many people see it as a panacea or a solution that magically mints money. We should never forget there's a real clear distinction between financing and funding. Financing is a creative way and kind of scary way to amortize your costs over a long period of time. And funding is how you pay for it. Funding can come from the federal government, but funding can sometimes be embedded in the project. And so one of the things I think we need to learn is, as you look at a project, as a community, there are assets there that have value. There are assets that you can find efficiencies in. If you can extract that value or that efficiency, there's your funding. I'll stop there.
Well, it is indeed a privilege and honor to be here with such a distinguished group of panelists today. I want to first thank Congressman Cummings for his passionate defense of our programs over the years. He's had to defend them. Believe me, they haven't just been there for us. They've been tried to be taken away for years. But also, I want to point out that Dr. Scott helped me particularly as an advocate in Boston, and then Mike Garner, he helped me also in New York City. I have to give a shout out to the Congressional Black Caucus in 1982, led by Perrin Mitchell. That's when the Surface Transportation Act was signed, and Reagan had to give 10% of the work for the repair of the infrastructure to minority businesses. That inspired me to feel that I had an opportunity. I left the practice of the law and started a railroad construction company. I joined Compto over 30 years ago, and over the years, each of these organizations have been absolutely essential to our journey and path toward inclusion here in this transportation industry. And I think that anybody here who is associated and working with these organizations, well, you're not wasting your time, and this is essential for us to continue to survive. So I say thank you to all of them. Now, I want to speak a little bit just about what we do. We build railroads, and we do it all over the country. We've done it for quite some time, from Los Angeles and San Francisco to Dallas. We built the Atlanta streetcar system. We built the Washington streetcar system here. We are now currently working on a project, the Silver Line 2 from Tyson's Corner to the Dulles Airport. We try to make certain that our workforce looks like our ridership. We now have can boast of over 65% of being minorities and women. We work with all of the local organizations, with the Urban League. We work with Compto. We work. I've had Brad and other members of Compto work with me right here in Washington. Even we worked with a group called Transportation Diversity Committee. I think some of you guys know him. Dwayne Sampson. I went to the Bronx. He had a construction academy, high school, where he had graduates coming out, and he asked me to come take a look at them. We had, I did. They made a presentation. We hired 25 of them immediately after graduation, brought them to Washington to work on the Safe Track program. We trained them, we housed them. They were making $27, $28 an hour plus benefits. We started last June before last, and right now, these students are now young men and women who are now being trained with skills to now be the transferable skills in the rail industry. So we're doing these things focused on doing what we can with regard to the workforce and doing well by doing good. That's what we hope to do. That's our motto in the business. Right now, the Trump administration is coming out with a new plan, their Trump infrastructure policy. And there's going to be new ways of funding and financing these programs. And we have to be aware of them and make certain that we get involved at a local level. We got a local level early on. Right now, for example, the Purple Line here in Maryland, that's going to be a P3. However, it's going to be a P3 that does have goals that will be enforced, and that's a tribute to Congressman Cummings and the MTA here in Maryland, who made certain that nothing was going to happen here in this state without us being included. Well, everybody is not like the state of Maryland. A lot of us are from different places here, and we have to make certain, again, that we play that role initially in order to make certain that we are included. Now, also, when we're speaking of financing and different ways in which we have to make certain that we are included, let's look at FRA. At FRA, that's the only agency within the Department of Transportation that has no minority business program. I've been fighting this for a number of years. We finally got the Obama administration to agree to do a disparity study. And that disparity study was going to be the key to now being able to put a bill together and have a DBE program. Well, the reason why that's important is not just because of the grants and the money that the FRA gives away, and that's billions of dollars every year. But let's talk about the RIF program. The RIF program is a means of financing rail projects. It's called the Railroad Rehabilitation Infrastructure Financing. Well, under that, the FRA administrator can actually get loan guarantees, loan money, and give grants for up to $35 billion. Well, guess who's not included? We are not, okay? And we have to say something about this. We can't just let these things happen as if we didn't know, okay? And this is one of the reasons why I'm here today to talk about some of these things. I have to commend Regina for some of the things she said with regard to the executive order that President Trump just came down with last month. In Chicago, we worked on one of the biggest projects they'd had in over 40 years. And we ended up doing that project with over 70% minorities and women. And at the end of the project, it was considered to be the model in this nation for what and how these projects should be done in terms of workforce inclusiveness and certainly minority business inclusiveness. Well, we did it under the Workforce Initiative Act that Chicago had, and it was a local preference deal. Well, now, that allowed us to hire people who are now still working in the rail industry, to give them jobs. Some of them are working for me now. That was in 2013. The point is that those opportunities will be taken away from our inner city children, okay, if we don't get up and say something about it. It makes a difference. It makes a real difference here. And President Trump ended this without any discussion. You know, it was just done quietly. And all of a sudden, places like Washington, places like Chicago, we can't insist that we have a good percentage of minority inclusiveness with regard to our workforce. Fortunately, we have good members, actually members of COMTO who are working in the transit authorities here who can insist, certainly let the bidders know what we're looking for, but we have to do that and be vigilant on it. Now, there are just a couple of things, I guess in the interest of time, that I'm going to be very brief about, but we still have to deal with things such as the net worth requirements or the caps for small businesses. Okay, right now I thank Congressman Cummings and his staff they actually put in an amendment to try and raise the cap number for the DOT for 23 million in small business to 36 million to equalize it with SBA. It didn't go through for a number of reasons, but Senator Booker now is trying to do the same, the very similar language with the Federal Aviation Authority Act here. And if they do that, then it's going to give the major contractors less reason to say they can't find anybody to do anything substantive in terms of doing these projects that they're going to have. Also,
and Mr. Clark, if I could stop you there, just so we can open it up to a broader discussion. But I am sort of curious because there's been a lot of talk about this administration and how it differs from the previous administration in focus. You had the Obama administration with the initiative, the Ladders of Opportunity, and other things that were particularly interested in making sure disenfranchised communities were included in metropolitan planning organizations and other initiatives. We don't know at this point, I don't think the administration has laid out a very clear plan of how they're going to approach a lot of these issues. And right now, Congress is focused on some other things, of course, tax and health care. But I guess if each of you could kind of talk about what you feel like are some of the main priorities that you would like to see the Trump administration, particularly like Secretary Chao, the Department of Transportation, and Congress take up this year? What are some legislative priorities, and what are some funding mechanisms that you haven't seen included in this discussion of this $1 trillion infrastructure plan that might be useful in addition to the private investment? And if anybody wants to, yeah, sure.
Oh, I could take it up. Well, of course, I mean, I think people have made it more than crystal clear. The whole issue of funding and financing are two different things, and there is no free money. And so based on anything we're hearing at this point in time about the biggest number that's been thrown out there is potentially $200 million. And we all know that, my God, with the trillions of dollars in issues in terms of what we don't have in infrastructure, that's really a paltry amount, okay? I'm going to tell you, I'm a great proponent of The Wizard of Oz and Dorothy in the red shoes, okay? And we always trying to look for, remember she go through all this with the yellow brick road, she going with the witches, she with the all, and then she gets to the whole end of it, and the wizard tells, the good witch Glinda tells her, she say, look down and click your heels because you always had the power, okay? And so what I would simply say is that in addition to, we know what needs to be done and what more could be codified, and oh my God, the President Obama, his administration, and really crystallizing the importance in terms of the opportunities agenda, it was perfect. But what I'm saying is that where we are right now, standing where we are, we have so much power. And in addition to that, did you hear what I said? 70% of the action is taking place at the state and local level. Through the years, the erosion of what's happened, I mean, it's like, I'm glad we're here in Washington. I'm not taking anything away from that. But the reality is that we have in our hands so much power. Most of the innovation that's taking place, period, across the board, is really coming from state and local areas. So making sure that so do what we can where we are, plus keep pushing here. But make sure, just like the gentleman, everybody said, it is so important that our communities really understand decision making and that they're engaged in that decision making. What are the tools that we already have that can be used? For example, Keith Parker, stand on up here. You got to do what you can do. The U.S. Employment Plan. I'm on the board for Jobs to Move America. Okay, stand on up, Marta. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, and anybody that's in here from L.A. and from Chicago, U.S. Employment Plan is on the books. It gives you the opportunity. They're having a new rail manufacturing facility that is in the south side of Chicago because there was courage, knowledge, and courage amongst their local leadership to put the U.S. Employment Plan provisions within New York. Let me say amen to New York, the last 1,000 cars that they just came up with. So there are many tools that we have. We need to know what they are. We need to use them to what the sister said right here, no question. The pilot program that was the local hire, we just heard about that. There are those of us that we need Compto. We know Compto will be right there. But let me tell you what LA did, and that's another thing. I'm gonna say this and I'm gonna shut up for a minute. What LA did was, because you know the whole thing, oh, if you want to do anything local and you're using federal dollars, you can't use federal dollars and have a geographic preference. So let me tell you what LA did. What LA did say, okay, we got one for you. We're not going to wind up calling. We're not going. They did the local preference too, but what they did, they were smart. They went through every single zip code that they had. They say, we ain't doing local. We going to categorize every one of our zip codes by disadvantage and extremely disadvantaged under all the rules of engagement. And then we're going to monitor, track, and say these zip codes, it's not about local. It's about those who are economically disadvantaged areas, regardless of how you defined it in the United States. You see what I'm saying? And then they have requirements and provisions within all of their contracts. People have to wind up reporting on that. They check on it. They look at them. So what I'm saying is, and this is why I thank Compto again, one of the things that we have discussed, and Renee and Lord Ron and everybody on the legislative committee, is stop talking. Let's get the toolkits, let's get the data together so that when we say these things, people can go and say, oh, I see, this is what they did, this is how they did it, here are copies of the provisions, here are people in procurement departments, legal departments, boards of directors that our people can talk to, because you know what, this is not rocket science. So there's a whole lot that still needs to be done. I'm looking at Red and Cleveland, they've done some fantastic things. And it's kind of like, you know, we almost kind of keep playing it again, Sam. So there are a lot of resources that we have, and I'm saying as well, let's use and take maximum advantage of that. And a lot of innovation really is going to be at the state and local level.
Well, just to follow up on that, if you're talking about a lot of the innovation happening at the state and local level, then what should the federal role be? Because we have an administration talking about $200 billion out of $1 trillion that they're planning to provide, and that would, of course, leave some room for financing tools, or maybe there's going to be some federal funding gaps. But what role do you think, the federal government should be playing in all of this?
The role that I think the federal government should be playing in this is the role to actually, we need to absolutely across the board rebuild American infrastructure, and that means that there needs to be a tremendous infusion in terms of funding. I want some benchmarks in terms of, I don't want any erosion in terms of environmental justice. I don't want any erosion in terms of the environmental rules and regulations. I don't want anything to wind up being rolled back in terms of SDBE, EEOC. I don't want any of that rolled back, okay? But the biggest thing that the federal government, but I also want to be able to have as much authority and control as I can at the local level, because I can touch your throat and do some things at the local level in terms of decision making that I cannot do when it becomes more distant up in DC. So what I need you to do, I need you to help me with the funding of the dollars. I need it to wind up give me some flexibility. I don't want to wind up throwing away the baby with the bathwater, but I'm not confusing myself in terms of direct accountability, representation, being able to touch decision making and making a difference. For me, I have seen repeatedly that starts at the local level.
And I would open that question to anybody else too on the panel.
Let me say that essentially the federal government should be leaders, effective leadership. But then Dr. Scott is right. Compto is more powerful than what they know. So about 2 years ago, we started in Compton, New York, meeting with Charlie Rango and our black congresspeople to tout effective programs that were going to work. And, you know, funny story, in the midst of chaos and confusion, there's still opportunity. I think that under this administration, which is going to be the most outlier administration that we have seen, there's still opportunity. And we got to make sure, in the words of Bob Marley, that we fight for our rights, we organize, and we demand that we get our fair share. You know, the congressman indicated that when God blesses you and puts you in leadership opportunities, that you got to really maximize the opportunity for people who look like you or who don't have a voice. And so when I was in college, I had the opportunity to spend time with Harold Washington, who was the first black mayor of the city of Chicago in 1983. And he said that I walk around with my urban planners. He said, you know why? I says, no. He says, because if you're not planning, you're being planned. If you're not planning, you're being planned. How many times have I had to sit in a senior level meeting at the MTA, which we have a $35 billion budget, and senior leadership and the big business community are trying to say what's best for the minority business community. So my response is, have you spoken to the minority business community? No. So we speak to the majority business community. Why aren't we speaking to the small MWBEs? If we haven't done that, this meeting is over. We're going to reschedule this meeting after we've had the opportunity to talk to them to find out what their needs are. And so we are going to listen to our large contractors, and we're going to listen to our emerging ones, because we're going to put programs in place that's going to allow us to award contracts in an inclusive manner. And I want to give a shout out to Cheryl McKissick, who is our chief engineer. Cheryl's family started a construction company in 1906, 1905 in Nashville, Tennessee. You know, and I met your cousin in Chicago a few weeks ago, Eric. But Cheryl's company is our chief engineer. Think about this. An organization spending $35 billion, $15 billion a year, but $35 billion in our capital plan. And her company is our chief engineer, making sure that our projects are finished safely, timely, and on budget. Opportunities.
Can I address your question? Excuse me. I just want to address your question. Sure. I had an opportunity, in fact, I insisted upon speaking with some of the Trump surrogates with regard to the infrastructure bill. And we did that last week. I did that in anticipation of coming here today. And the question was, well, what did you want? Okay, and what we wanted was workforce inclusiveness and to make certain that minority business were included in everything. So I told them about what our concerns were, okay, and what they agreed. They listened to each and every one of the points that we brought out. And what they're going to do is go back to there's a man there who's handling infrastructure program there. And we're going to have further meetings, okay, to talk about what we want out of this. And programs like the RIF program that I talked about, the P3s, which Regina talked about, these programs are concerning to us, and we want to make certain that we are included. And we have to be included at the planning process right now, and this is what we're asking for.
Two things, just and in follow up to that, when you were talking to officials from the Trump administration, my understanding is, I know the New York Times reported a few weeks ago that the DOT was going to do away with the regulation that was under the Obama administration that would ensure there was a certain percentage of local workers. Now, DOT did not confirm that, but I'm curious if anybody has any further clarification on that since then. Because
it's already happened.
Yeah.
It's already happened. We still have an opportunity to go back and try to compromise or some kind of way make certain that we are a part of it, but it's already happened.
So, sort of in that vein, just talking about what the Trump administration is doing currently, and I know, Regine, you brought up environmental permitting, and of course, the president signed an executive order, I believe it was in August 15th, that was supposed to sort of streamline or speed up environmental permitting. And I'm wondering, is it the sense of the panelists that there is enough? Like, what additionally could be done to improve this? Is this as big of a problem as this administration is making out to be? Because I know the Obama administration also did some work to streamline the permitting process. Or do you think there could be more done in that regard?
Oh, I do agree that there are always ways to improve an existing program or to existing laws and regulations. Definitely, there are some things that we can address. And the first environmental laws were passed quite a few years back. And a lot of them, like now, really, they focus on the physical environment in terms of the rural environment, biology, and things like that. But I think now it's more critical to address some of the issues that you find in inner cities or in the built environment than it is really a lot of wetlands. We still have to address those, but I think it's very critical now that the environmental laws also are tweaked to really address the issues that are most critical today, as opposed to what they were 30, 40 years ago. But when your improvement is really to do away with the environmental justice and some of those, then that becomes a little bit more, that becomes critical and that becomes a little worrisome, because that's really where you have an opportunity to address those equitable outcomes and put in place the tools to make sure that at the end you do end up with a product that doesn't negatively impact the disadvantage.
And I wonder with that, how do you strike a balance of making sure that you have a process that is not sort of delaying or slowing projects down, but that is still not undoing some of the environmental justice work that has happened? Because it seems like the administration is focused on that because that was something that they heard from stakeholders that, the environmental permitting process is too slow. We need to speed this up. So what is your sense of how, this could change? I just wonder if I could get a little more details on how this could be improved, or if anybody has thoughts on the panel about how that could be improved, or if they are finding that to be as big of an obstacle.
Well, I think that those 2 points you mentioned are kind of in conflict and in tension with each other. So there's a need to make sure that the environmental process is as comprehensive as it can be, to make sure we're not missing anything that's going to impact a group of people or a species or whatever the issue is. But process, it's a time question, and there's, if you're in the private sector, time is money. And sometimes, and this goes back to my comment about making sure we have capacity in the public sector to recognize that time is money. And every moment, every month, every week that we take to go through a process of doing it, it's costing somebody money and it's driving up the cost of the project and possibly taking another project that's at the bottom of the list further down the list. So in terms of delivering more infrastructure as a country, speeding up that time frame gives us more, our dollar goes farther. But can we do that without throwing away the protections that we need within that process? And I think that there's work to be done. It can be done. It's really just building the capacity, I think, on the public side to push that process a bit faster. That's my view.
And I know a lot of times, folks don't want to make it get wonky, but I cannot impress enough the importance of good data, okay? And that is, at the end of the day, that we've got to have that. So what are we going to be hearing? It's not just from this administration. We've heard it from more than this administration, that private is better, okay? I'm just telling you, these are the themes. Private is better. Well, we know you got the, trust, too big to fail, but anyway, private is better. Cheapest is the best value, lowest responsible bid. Rules, you got too many rules. Every time you got the rules, that increases burdens, so get rid of any conditions, rules, all that kind of stuff. So this is kind of the jargon that's back there. And every time, and what we have to do is to wind up bringing data to bear, because when you really look at it, and I'm going to say this as an example. It is some fascinating work. If you all really, we have to know our history. I could not understand to an extent how we could have in fact had a New Deal in the United States that was really responsible for building most of this infrastructure, much of modern infrastructure that we have, came from out of the Depression, putting people to work and all that. Now, it wasn't always us was going to work, but let's just say that was it, WPA. And then I fast forwarded and I said, there was nothing wrong with that. We built an entire basic, what was our modern infrastructure, on the notion of infrastructure, let's put people to work. What has actually happened? And I tell you the honest to God's truth, what actually happened, and this is so true, and I'm gonna tell you, I'll read some, I would invite you to go on the Jobs to Move America website and get some documentation on some extremely extensive research that they have done on where some of these rules came from. I tell you the honest to God's truth, the whole world of public procurement and the notion of what is a burden on the procurement process literally wound up being changed in the 1980s. I swear to God, I've been able to actually read stuff from Congressman Major Owens and stuff from the 80s around President Reagan and the big business community being upset about the anti-apartheid laws and sanctions from the 1980s. And so big business was really very, very upset. I don't want to overdo it, but big business was very upset because you started having increasingly state and local areas that were coming out with anti-apartheid sanctions. They weren't going to do business, they were divesting. And so then all of a sudden in the 80s, not because there were facts that drove it or even law, we started getting interpretations by the U.S. Justice Department, OMB and them, that of what were now new burdens on competition. So what were burdens on competition? This is where you start getting things like, oh, if you put jobs language and stuff, that's a burden on competition. If you wind up having SDMD, WBE, anything other than price and cost wound up becoming to get interpreted as a burden on competition. So what I'm saying to you is that, so these are the kinds of things that insidiously get baked into, because then what did that become? It became a part of the common grant rule. You got to follow the seed corn on this, which made it very, very difficult even for President Obama's administration to literally be able to institutionalize much of what they did in the Opportunities Program. It took them almost 3 years. And the right people sitting behind the table at USDOT as staff, Dorval Carter, Therese McMillan, people like that, to literally, Peter Rogoff, to literally wind up being able to get through new interpretation in space so that you could, in fact, put out a U.S. employment plan that you could wind up having that would pass the muster of a federal department. So this stuff is thick. And so I say we have to know our history, what's backed up by fact and what is not, okay? We need to example. In these P3s, there's a term, value for money, VFM. What is VFM? Okay, that's how people are making evaluations on these private sector deals. Well, I say the VFM, that's only a financial economic piece. If we really mean that we want to wind up including community benefits, then we need to expand that numerator and denominator so it's not just about that kind of value for money. It needs to include the other things that we've talked about, which are the multiplier effect of transportation investment. Those are the kinds of things that are granular. They are taking it apart, putting it back together, and making sure that we do it the right way. So I'm doing a lot of preaching on it, but it's because of the fact that this stuff is deep, 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 and you have to really dissect it to understand how to fight it and how to reverse it.
And if I may say something regarding the environmental laws, very often when we've had to go back and it takes a lot longer than normal, it's because we didn't do it right the first time. And we had to go back to the drawing page. That's really where a lot of that comes from. And if it takes longer to do it right, then it takes a lot longer because we have to do it right. Those are investment of hundreds of millions of dollars. And then people's lives also are being impacted.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the audience. If anybody has any questions, I believe there's a mic circulating around. Yeah. Mic right there. I have a question right over here.
I have a quick question. I'm not sure I even need a the mic. Okay. Okay, hold it. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Stacy Key, and I sit on the GDOT board for the Georgia Department of Transportation. And I thought I heard you say, did I hear you say correctly that recently President Trump has rolled back regulations requiring DBE participation on federal transportation projects? Did I hear that? I didn't hear. Okay. I want to make sure I heard you say something about requirements and contracting, so I want to clarify what you said.
I spoke to the local preference.
Local preference. Okay. So I want to hire.
Yes.
Please clarify exactly what you said.
Yeah, the local preference hiring. That was very important in terms of our workforce development.
And that had really been it was a pilot program, and that pilot program was now being extended for an additional 5 years, which would have taken it, I think, to 2022. And that's what was actually rolled back. It was always a pilot program.
Do you understand?
Hi, I'm Ken McCraley from Minneapolis, and Michael, you talked about the union involvement in transportation projects, but we kind of know in Minnesota that the union is restrictive of participation all the way around, no matter what database you're in, what certification you have to be union to do transportation projects. So if you have a big pool of minority contractors that can perform, you usually have a really small or no pool of MWBs or MBEs to perform those projects, and that's where the money comes from. So can you talk about that?
So I said that the unions in certain cities have not been as inclusive as they could be and should be. And if you advocate for transportation funding, the agencies get it, and they basically make the awards to the large prime contractors who have a COB. And if you're not union, you can't work on that project, right? But there's no law that says that an agency must award their contracts only to contractors who are union. So what we've been doing, and we understand the MWDB goal setting process and monitoring and enforcing it, that's all well, fine and good. But you're really not going to grow and develop your emerging certified firms unless you give them the opportunity to compete as prime contractors. So we've been debundling or designing smaller packages. The MTA is one of the largest builders in the country. We have a $10 billion project going on right now and another $8 billion project going on, building a new subway line on 2nd Avenue. So we've started debundling, recruiting minority women-owned firms, and bringing them in, and they're starting to bid to us on prime contracts, and a funny thing is happening. They're winning. They are non-union. So it is no law that the MTA must award contracts to union contractors as long as they're paying their prevailing wages.
I agree with that. That might work in New York, but 99% of the other states, it doesn't work. And that's why MBEs and MWBs aren't getting work. And you can have big databases and really small percentages of that.
But what's stopping your agencies from debundling or designing smaller packages? And the argument may be that it's more cost effective to manage one major project than 7 smaller ones. If that's the response that you're getting, I would say that's true, but that one project is excluding smaller minority businesses from sharing in taxpayers' dollars. That's the refute to that argument.
That's one part of it. The other part of it is that the prime contractor is signatory, so he'll only work with. That's part of it, but the other part is that the prime contractor is signatory to other union companies, so he'll only work with union companies.
But if you debundle your projects and that MWBE is a prime contractor and wins a prime contract, and if he's non-union, he can use whoever he wants to use.
We've had no problem with that in Chicago and also in Washington. It's about developing relationships with the unions. And everybody becomes a union member, and the union ends up having more members and more dues.
Yeah, I was just going to make a little comment there too, is that a lot of this is another reason I love local, okay? This is politics. This is plain old politics and business. It's not even business, it's business, okay? And so literally, when you're talking about these community benefits agreements and what's all important and who's going to be at the table and how we're going to play, these are beyond conversations. I'm talking about folks in back rooms sitting down, minority and women's business enterprise, organized labor, I'm just preaching to the best time to do all of that is before you got the money. Okay, because before you got the money, and then the whole piece is in terms of jobs creation, workforce development, apprenticeship programs, and all of that, because there really are examples nationally of where, and labor gets it, because just like GW is saying about, it's dues and members, okay, but they've been doing things in many instances the way they have, so you have to change that.
Lenny Chisholm out of Minneapolis. There's a rule that in 1987 they added women into the disadvantaged business pool. And the elephant in the room, and I think any contractor can attest to that, is that didn't include minority women, basically. That was a white woman clause. And today, as I walk through the halls of Congress, and I've been coming out here for several years, no one really wants to take that elephant on and say we need to make women and minority goals so that the minorities can actually participate at a larger percentage. What are your thoughts on that elephant in the room?
Well,
Go ahead.
back in the day when, they're always challenging the minority business programs, but we were basically told that in order to get the votes to sustain the program, we would need to include women, okay? And so we decided that we would move with that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any program right now. And that was back in the 80s.
So at the MTA in the state of New York, it's state policy that 15% of contracts are awarded to the MBs and 15% are awarded to the WBs. So they're on equal playing field.
Well, this is the USDOT Federal Highway Administration program, which does not have separate goals. They will not undertake the separation of goals of women and minorities. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've not thought that much because we're the largest recipients of FTA funding. That's federal transit. Under the FTA, under those rules, it's not there, but it's a DBE focus. But on our state-funded projects, we segregate 15-15.
I have a question. My name is Lionel Collins, and since the gentleman mentioned the elephant in the room, for the last couple of years, I spent 21 years on the Hill, and the discussion now is earmarks. When President Obama was president, he said no earmarks, and Speaker Boehner was opposed to earmarks, so we had no earmarks. Now the discussion has been, you talk to Republican members, for 8 years they had nothing to go back to the congressional district to show that they bridge, highway, water system, whatever. Now there's a lot of discussion about earmarks, and the question is, has the organization taken a position on earmarks and the panelists? And the reason I raise it up because with this administration, if we don't have earmarks, the funding will never get into the inner city, our folks. The funding will be with the Republican members now, and the Democrats will be cut off. But with earmarks, at least everybody should get a piece of the action. So my question is, has the organization or anybody has an opinion about earmarks?
Well, I certainly can't speak for the organization, but I'll open it up to the panelists.
Well, I'll be honest, I've had a lot of beneficial pork in my day, okay, and I'm saying, and I'll just leave it at that and say oink, oink, okay?
Anyone else?
I'd double down on that. I think earmarks are great when they come into your pocket, right? The one thing I will say is if you look at the innovative finance programs coming out of FTA, federal highways, the majority of those projects are going to go to the inner city because most of the deals where there is a revenue stream, where there is something you can capture, are going to go to the city where you have density, you have people, you have revenue being transacted on toll roads, for example. So there is kind of a built-in space for cities to be able to finance through federal programs their improvements in ports, highways, and possibly even rail. So It's a consolation, I guess.
Unfortunately, it's not going to be that much real.
You know, that's the thing. We asked the question earlier about what do we think about the plan and what do we. It's hard to really comment on a 3-page plan. There is really not much to say because 200 billion, 1 trillion. How do they how do they correlate? We don't know. So it's hard to. We can't really comment on. I can't comment on that.
Infrastructure does not necessarily mean transportation,
Yes.
and we got to keep that in mind.
It doesn't mean transit.
Well, sort of following up on the earmarks question, I'm curious because, we're at a point where we have an FAA reauthorization that looks like it's going to be extended. There won't be a long-term, I could be wrong, but it sort of looks that way, that they're going to do a 6-month extension. Of course, we had the highway bill, the FAST Act that passed and was signed into law a couple years ago that had $305 billion. But I'm wondering, do you think that, there's a chance that these bills, these laws would be moving more quickly or would be more significant if we still had the earmarks? I'm just curious how you think that is sort of impacting the kind of infrastructure packages we're seeing coming out of Washington these days.
I don't really think that that's really the issue. The bottom line is that until we get serious, and that goes across, we had 32, 33, or 34 continuing resolutions on the last one, okay? It's not that people don't know what the issue is. They just, and that was with a democratically dominated, with the White House, the whole 9 yards, figuring out how we're going to fund the whole thing is a big elephant in the room, and there has been no resolution on that. So everything's been these stopgap measures. And so there's the opportunity for really, and a need for a really big one here with the Trump administration, because the need is obvious.
Let me say, I would like to pivot for a minute and just state, I stated early on that I fly around the country and speak on panels, but I don't want these panels to turn into a mowing session.
Right.
And so the immediate next steps, what are the immediate next steps? One, I'm going to invite Compton, New York, into City Hall the next time I meet with them in 2 weeks, because I wanted Compton to be able to help and shape policy, right? Second, if there are other Compton chapters in the room, they should be meeting with their local elected officials and putting policy in place that's going to allow the cities and the states to award their contracts in a more inclusive manner. Three, I want to give a special shout out because the MTA's program is starting to get national and international exposure. The transportation system in London called and they said that they wanted to share some best practices with us because we're doing some innovative things. I want to just thank Shelton Russell for highlighting our program on the cover of American DBE. Thank you. And if you're not subscribing to this, not because we're on the cover, but because it's some very, very valuable information as to the trends of what's happening nationally with MW and DBEs.
But to go from there, if we're talking about, yes, how do we move forward? So maybe what do we need to do is identify what the needs are in our community to take advantage of this innovative, contracting projects that are coming down the line. What is needed? What do we need to do? Do we need to train people? Do we need to educate them more about what P3, what it entails? Because those are very complex deals, and you better be very educated about them and know what you're getting yourself into in order to be a partner. Because otherwise, that is something that can really destroy your company if you're not very careful about the type of deal that you are getting yourself into. And what is important, schedule, delivering, your reputation, your knowledge of the local market and the people what do you bring to a consortium that is doing P3? So I think those are the questions we need to ask ourselves next, because that is coming. That is something that, no matter how we view it, this is on the table. We actually behind, the United States a little behind the curve when it comes to P3, because other countries are using them a lot more, Canada, Australia, and Europe. But it's a trend that is coming, and we see all these actually major companies from Europe and other countries investing and purchasing our companies in the US. A lot of our major global firms are no longer owned, by US, but by foreign entities, which means they're preparing themselves to come over and to deliver those major projects how do we ensure that we don't fall behind our community, or usually we're the last one that take advantage of anything, and how do we make sure that we are ready to actually be part of these projects?
I forgot to mention also that we're going to be scheduling our second annual MTA, FTA, Compton National, Compton, New York, Opportunity Day in New York, so you guys can influence how we're going to spend some of this $34 billion. My second hat, I was in City Hall this week. The city of New York is going to give the 100 black men some funding to go across the country, bring in out-of-city and out-of-state firms to come to the city of New York and get certified and take advantage of some of the contractual opportunities for the city of New York. So stay tuned.
And like I said,
We're going to get a date, call you, schedule it, so everybody can put it on their calendar. It's the second annual one.
And like I said, what I promised to Brad, I said, Brad, I've been around all these years. I said, the old girl's still rolling. I said, what I'm going to do, I promised. I said, I'm going to put every bit of energy and effort into all this burden on the common. All these things you have to be around a long time to know about, and really on the best practices, what is out there, who's put the policies together, so that we can, it can be more, it's more an education and information. It's more at your fingers as opposed to, somebody's doing something here and somebody. So that's one of the things, working with Bev and Renee and Rhonda and Beverly, just that is an absolute commitment that we just don't talk about it, that we really pull it together.
We're going to have to continue to engage with COMTO and Congressional Black Caucus. This just can't happen during Congressional Black Caucus weekend. This is a very, very important, everybody is looking for your ideas. Those of us who are working as minority contractors, we have our ideas and can make our suggestions, but we need to be supportive of people like Congressman Cummings. The entire caucus is making a difference. COMTO is making a difference, but we have to make certain that they have an input from all of us. If we can do that, we can make a difference, and this is why we're here.
All right. Well, do we have time for one more question, or is that? All right, we have time for one more question, if anybody has a burning desire. No? Okay, here we are. Right here.
Dawn Tucker Thomas. I'm with U.S. Department of Transportation, Office of the Secretary, but I'm speaking on behalf of being an attendee today and not a federal employee. To my understanding, that earmarks were done away with underneath Safety Lou. So now, underneath the MAP 21 as well as the FAST Act, everything is full and open competition now.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's informative. All right, well, I think that's the end of our panel. I want to thank everybody for being here. This has been a lovely panel. Please give a round of applause. All right, stay seated. But thank you again, COMTO, for having me. And yeah.
Hold on. Always to close out, let's bring the congressman back up for some closing remarks. Okay?
I want to again thank our panelists for doing a great job. Give them a hand, please. As I listened to Dr. Scott, I could not help but think about something that I say to my staff every day. If you were to talk to any member of my staffs, they would tell, and you ask them, what do I talk about most? They will tell you that I talk about being effective and efficient. Dr. Scott talked about how she has seen so much for so many years. And Dr. Scott, I know you can relate to what I'm about to say. A lot of times we have young people who come under us, and they're brilliant people, they have passion, they're smart, but they ain't been where we've been. And a lot of times we can see things 10 miles down the road and we say we do this way today, this is the effect it's going to have. This is what I want to get to. I love COMTO. And I'm saying this to every organization that has any political bend to it. Ladies and gentlemen, I have not come here to ask you. I have come here to beg you to use the energy that you have to continue to be effective and efficient. When we were talking about the Affordable Care Act, and I'm just going to use this as an example, everybody, they come up with all these different plans about how everybody's going to have health insurance and all that. I say one thing, follow the money. All you got to do is follow the money. You don't take billions out of something and don't lose something. Come on now. Come on. And what I'm saying to you is that all of us can play a role wherever we are. Wherever we are. We may be on a board. We may be part of an agency. We may be, wherever we are. The philosopher Voltaire said, cultivate your own garden. Wherever you are. And you'd be amazed at how just speaking up and saying something or pushing something and saying, well, wait a minute, what happened to the black people? Where are they? You know, every time I meet with these big companies, I say, how many African Americans you got on your board? I want to know. And so we have to, Martin Luther King said, the greatest thing that a citizen can do is assert the full measure of their citizenship. And so I have come here again to remind all of us that we're on a mission. We really are. But you know what? Sometimes, and I'm not talking about COMTO, I'm talking about a lot of organizations, people are going in circles. They're going in circles, they come, they have a nice time, party. You know, girl, I had a nice time. Amen, come on now, you don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. But the question is what did we achieve? What road did we build for future generations? That's what it's all about. And so I thank all of you for being here. I want you to go out there full of energy, full of hope, and say, you know what? Yeah, we're going through a storm, but we've been through storms before. I shall never forget, and I'll close with this, I'll never forget the ABC News had right after the election, they went up to this church, Brother Mims, and said this old lady, they wanted to interview her about the election, right? This is a Sunday after the election. So she's coming out of church, she's shaking, got a little cane, a little pocketbook. And the reporter says, how are you? She said, I'm doing fine. And she said, did you vote in the election? Yeah, I voted. Who'd you vote for? Hillary Clinton. And she said, how do you feel about things that are going on with Mr. Trump? Were you disappointed? Yeah. I was disappointed. And then she said, are you scared? She said, things are scary, but I ain't scared. Here was a woman who only had a Social Security card, only had a Medicare card, didn't have a Tesla, didn't have all of that, definitely didn't have no job. But she was not scared. And I've discovered the way you deal with fear is to go up against whatever you're going up against. Period. You got to do it. And if you don't do it for yourselves, do it for the children that you raise. Do it for the grandbaby that you're so proud of. Do it for them. And the other thing that we have to do, and I was the first person in the Congressional Black Caucus to say this. Ladies and gentlemen, we must guard our democracy. We got to guard this democracy. This democracy has allowed every single person in this room to live the life that you live. Too often we take for granted this democracy. And so then you have Trump coming in, tearing apart the CIA, the FBI, the Office of Government Ethics, then create something called the voter fraud, voter integrity. When I met with him, I said it's a fraud. I said, if you want to deal with voter integrity, deal with the fact that so many people who look like me are being denied the right to vote. And I didn't say it, federal judges said it. What's up with that? And so what I'm saying to you, wherever we are, God has brought us. When I was laying in that sick bed, you know, I used to hear I'm almost finished, brother man. I used to hear the people in church talk about the sick and shut in. Oh, God. I was shut in and I was sick. But I laid there and I thought about life. And I said, Elijah, you're going through this for a reason. There's no reason why God would bring you to a cliff and not push you over. So you come back stronger. Again, what I said, through your pain. And some of y'all been through some pain. Don't act like you ain't never catch no bus. Don't act like you weren't like me and had a Pinto. See, so most of y'all don't even know what a Pinto is. Amen. Amen for the Pinto. You didn't know whether that sucker was going to get 30 miles, but you did the best you could with what you had. What I'm saying is I want you to remember those days when you had to borrow car fare. Remember the days when your mother had to spend 30 cents to get on the bus so she could go to some other community to take care of somebody's children. Come on now.
Yes, sir. Teach it, man.
Think about the people that many of you were taken from one neighborhood to another on a what? A bus. So that you could have a better life. And so we must bring all of that together as we go into wherever y'all work or whatever you do. And that is so very, very important. And so I come here to say, Comto, be charged up. Like the lady said, it may be scary. It may be scary because so much is unpredictable. It may be scary because so many people are talking about alternative facts. It may be scary because so many people are lying. It may be scary because you can't seem to trust anybody. But I beg you, realize that it may be scary, but I ain't scared.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hello. That concludes our thing. Let's give the panel a hand again. And let's thank Congressman Cummings for our panel. Thank you.